Hey everybody, welcome to another live Substack with Wajahat Ali for the Left Hook Substack, where I invite a subject matter expert who's far smarter than me to break down the emerging chaos of the day. And I have my friend Jared Yates Sexton, whose Substack you must read. It is called Dispatches from a Collapsing State. He has written several books predicting what I call Trump's murder suicide of the United States, and now it seems like the global economy. I feel like, Jared, I should just press play on you and have you speak for the next 25 minutes because you have been reading, researching, writing, and warning about what would happen if not just Donald Trump, but what you and I have called a right wing authoritarian movement, which is now what the Republican Party is because MAGA has taken over, gets power again. And, a plurality of American voters said, you know what, we can't have a black Indian American woman be president. Let's go with the criminal Bulgarian who was held liable for rape and has been bankrupted 6 times, including 2 casinos, to make America great again. I'm convinced in the future, if we are alive, and in the human species, I mean, and aliens look at us, they'll be like, these were the dumbest mother effers on the planet. They elected a guy who already effed up the economy in his first term, and then they brought him back to save the economy, even though clearly this guy is a terrible business person who does not understand how trade deficits work. But with that, Jared, I give it to you, sir. Talk to us about Trump's murder suicide of America, and if you believe, then my framing is too harsh.
No, in fact, I think that you are sort of giving it to people a little bit easy so we can get fully into this thing. And I appreciate you having me. Waj, you and I was thinking about this. We've been talking now for like the past 7 years, six,
Yeah.
7 years. And we kept having these conversations. And I said this the other day to someone else. There are only a handful of people right now that I've seen be right about these things and who talks about them accurately and actually, like, portrays it like it actually is. And I count you among the very, very few. And the conversations that we've had in the past, we told people this was going to happen. We told people exactly where it was going to go, what we were going to see from this thing. And in fact, anybody who looked at this thing, I think, through a lens of clarity, they knew where this thing was going.
Mm,
And it's a decision, and it's actually interesting to frame it as like a murder suicide. In a way, it's a little bit like a double suicide
mm,
almost. It's a group of people in this country that are so terrified of losing even perceived power.
mm.
Like in some ways, there are elements that obviously that there's power within white privilege or male privilege, or within certain sectors and economic places. But it is essentially watching not just Donald Trump, who in his first term was disastrous, but I assume you saw as well as I have, he's declined. Like,
Yeah.
he's actually gotten worse. And I don't
Yep.
just mean in terms of how he presents himself, because this is a guy who he hasn't just slipped, he's gone. And, more or less, we have a mad king type situation. And any number of the developments we've seen are originating not even a productive standpoint, but actually in a destructive standpoint. Right, like there are things that exist that now have to be done away with, or we have to move in a declining motion, and it is this strange thing that the people who have voted for him and the cult members who stick with him, despite the fact that their 401ks are being absolutely liquidated right now, despite the fact that they and their families and their children, because let's not forget that part of it, we're getting ready for child labor in this country. We've already
Mm.
taken steps toward it, but it's increasing at this point. Education's being gotten rid of. They are literally embracing diseases that have been virtually eradicated and putting their children not just in a place where they're going to get measles, which is a terrible disease, but on top of that, what have they been doing for years, Wash? They've been putting them in schools where they are bound to get shot or at least survive some type
Yeah.
of awful situation. And so when you look at that and you look at these maneuvers that have gone back and forth between MAGA and the MAGA faithful, what you're actually seeing at this point is a sort of degeneration where you have people who are either so terrified or have lost hope in anything better. And the only thing that matters to them is the catharsis of seeing people suffer.
Yeah.
And that feedback loop that we're talking about, it's not just something that hurts politics and the economy or hurts culture. It's literally going to kill people, and it's going to kill people who are involved in it. Like they have more or less joined hands and are jumping into the abyss together. So I think that framing even sort of takes away from the actual true disturbing nature of this thing. It's more or less a double suicide.
Yeah, not a murder suicide, a double suicide. And that was really eloquent. And I appreciate that because what we're witnessing essentially, and I've used these words before on television, on CNN, on MSNBC, is that it's a death cult.
Yes,
It's a death cult, cosplaying as a pro-life movement.
that's right.
But all their policies do not promote life. For example, I'm glad you mentioned this attack on science, on the attack on the CDC, the attack on the NIH, National Institute of Health. Folks, we have 3 deaths from measles in America. And that just recorded. It went from Texas, it went to New Mexico, in Kentucky, in Maryland, and those are just the reported cases. So we are making measles great again, which, by the way, like Jared said, we were able to prevent. But if you don't get the vaccines, highly contagious and kills people. We got bird flu, we got COVID. Speaking about child labor, I'm glad you mentioned that. Florida now is openly saying, yeah, let's reduce the ages for child labor. 15-year-olds, let's get them working. Why not? Pull yourself up from the bootstraps, right? Sarah Huckabee, she goes, look at that. We're removing the regulations that were put in place because, children were dying in mines. So we had child labor laws,
Yeah.
right? So we're going to gut the public education system, which has been I got like 800 kids here, so I apologize. That's why I got the Papa Bear. So my kids are very popular. There's like 6 kids in my home at all times. But,
Sure.
they mentioned it's a blessing. I love it. I love the fact that there's all these wild kids. I hope they're happy. I hope they don't get measles. I hope they're not working in mines. They're destroying the public education system,
Yep.
which educates 90% of our kids, because that has been the plan since Board versus Brown of education, right?
Yep.
The
That's right.
culture war, Jared, and you know this, was never first and foremost abortion or
No,
LGBTQ. Those are add-ons. The
that was
core of
chapter
it,
two.
that
Yep.
was the chapter one that they keep going back to, has always been segregation in schools, right? Racism, white supremacy, and they want to dismantle the public education system, privatize it, do charter schools, keep our kids stupid, keep our kids sick, keep our kids working until death. And then you have to work until death, folks, because guess what? You got no social security left anymore. You got no pensions. So all that money is going to go where? Up. And even right now, I'm sure you heard this cruelty. They don't even realize, Jared, how cruel they sound. As, like you said, people are freaking out about their pensions, losing their businesses. People are finally figuring out what trade wars are and tariffs are. The Trump administration and their acolytes, Megyn Kelly, JD Vance, I'm sure you've heard them say this. Buy the dip. You survived it
Yep.
before, you could survive it again. Pain, it's temporary. No gain without pain. Not realizing they're millionaires. They can afford to buy the dip or go through the pain, but the rest of us will lose our homes. We have no money left, right? That cruelty,
Yep.
Jared. Talk to us about we'll talk about the racism, but talk to us about the capitalist mindset of these individuals and how they seek to profit off the collapse and the double suicide.
So there's a couple of things happening there, and I'm so glad you brought it up this way. I think a really easy frame, because quite frankly, you and I have been studying this for a while, so we know what's behind it. But when most people look at it, they sort of, and they're not sort of used to it and inundated with it from an analytical studying type point, the soul recoils in horror, right? Because literally, it's like coming across a psychopath and being
Yeah.
like, oh my God, that's out there in the world. Oh, I'm face to face with a predator right now, right? And a good lens for this, Waj, is to think about what it is that these people do when they're not in politics. And what do? They grift people. They steal their money. They take advantage of their insecurities. So something like, let's say, the online manosphere, right? In which lonely, insecure, terrified young white men are being preyed upon by modern MLM internet scammers, right? Which is, yeah, you're an incel and you are disgusting, but I'm an alpha male like Andrew Tate, and I'm going to teach you how to get women and how to get tough and how to do all this. All you have to do is basically hand over your social security number, right? And we're going to drain you completely dry. To do that, and by the way, the entirety of this infrastructure is based on that. You think about someone like an Alex Jones, who has been peddling lies his entire career that has gotten people killed.
Yeah.
literally has led to deaths, that has harassed families that are mourning the fact that their children were killed in a school shooting, right? There's something missing there. There is an element of conscience and a missing element of shame that you and I wouldn't be able to do this,
You know,
right?
me and Mehdi, I don't want to interrupt you, but me and Mehdi Hassan of Zateo, we've been saying this for years, both publicly and privately. How do you shame shameless people, Jared?
You can't. And that's the entire point of this thing, is that what's actually happening on the larger scale is just a reflection of what we just discussed on the smaller scale. It's just scaled up. And basically at this point, I keep looking at people who say, well, what is he doing with the economy? It's obvious what they're doing with the economy. The people and Trump, that's the issue here, is like we get caught up because Trump, and the fact is that mentally he's gone, right?
Yeah,
I don't think he actually understands what he's doing half the time. He's running on instinct at this point in a way that I assume that me and many of the people, and maybe even you, we've seen when people get older, like sometimes people soften, and sometimes when the light goes out, their worst
occupying.
instincts come
Yeah,
out. We're watching that with him. And when you hear him talk, it's obvious that the people around him who have designed the demolition of the economy, they know what they're doing. And they know what they're doing because the wealthy in America who have bankrolled this entire thing and used it as a weapon, who have taken MAGA and basically pointed at America like a loaded gun, those people have researched every loophole. They've researched every strategy. There's a reason why these systems of like shipping people off to El Salvador, it's now quote unquote working. They figured out all the angles. They figured out all the conspiracy theories, all the appeals that are going to take advantage of these people, the same way that they took advantage of young white men who fear becoming incels, right? So what is actually occurring here is that we see this quote unquote medicine. It is about lowering the standard of living.
mm,
It's for some, it's about getting off the dollar and moving towards a Bitcoin or a cryptocurrency
yep.
that is under their explicit control, right? In other ways, it's about creating a crisis. And God knows that they love creating crises because then all of a sudden they get to exercise more power. Now, if you ask Donald Trump to explain any of this, I assume he would talk about groceries, right? Or maybe he had a phone call with Lee Iacocca this afternoon, you know? But what's
Deep
actually,
cuts, Jared. Deep cuts.
hey, listen, there are 6 people watching this who just got very excited. They're like, I get that reference.
There was like
Uh,
a tear of pride that, like, I understand that
I get
reference.
that. I get that. And so what's actually occurring right now is the same thing that's been building up. And you brought up Brown v. Board education, which is really, really important in this. The moment that the United States government asserted any control over white supremacists and the
Yep.
wealth class, it
Yep.
had to die. Period. It had to be dismantled. And originally it was segregation. And all those people pivoted over to abortion. And then eventually, painstakingly spending billions upon billions of dollars, they undermined the American government. They corrupted American politics. And they have set up this, which is for them the culmination of a plan that's been going on for decades. And so, this demolition that's taking place right now is just another sort of chapter in that larger plan that we're talking about.
No, and I appreciate that. You know, the I think the framing of that is accurate. Is that anytime this society, the government, decides to correct course, right, to put some accountability on white supremacy and capitalism, you've seen people fight back. Carol Anderson, great historian out of Emory, calls it, you know, like white rage, right? She did a fantastic book. It's 250 pages. Each and every single time, folks, there has been some movement towards progress. Two steps forward. White supremacy hijacks this country, chokeholds this country,
Yep.
backs the Civil War, right? The crackdown after Brown versus Board of Education. And I think we're witnessing the convergence of this because you talked about the convergent factors. They're not all in alignment, right?
Yep.
But there's the broligarchy, like you said. I interviewed Gil Duran. I hope people go back and see my interview with him last week. He's been following the broligarchy through something called the Nerd Reich. Fantastic reporting. He has been in the swamp of their ideology, right? And like you said, Jared, if you're a normie, and you listen to us right now, you're like, these what? No. But then once you dig just a little bit deeper, you're like, oh my God, this is what they
Yep.
believe. They are psychopaths. And
Yes.
so many people have this failure of imagination, Jared. I'm sure you encountered this as well before the election. It won't be that bad.
Yep.
The system will have its breakers. There will be a check. The Republicans will hold him to account. This is the United States of America. We're a democracy. And I say that it is a collective failure of imagination
Yes.
that Americans have had and an amnesia of our own history
Yep.
that they were unable to connect the dots. Because, like you mentioned, the Civil War, Brown versus Board of Education, segregation, rise of the broligarchy. It's all there. Reagan economics, nothing trickled down. And now this is on steroids. You got the broligarchy that wants to suppress the US economy, replace the dollar with the crypto, create nation states. You got
Yep.
people like Howard Lutnick, another psychopath, sounds like a complete sociopath, the Secretary of Commerce, who said, well, my grandmother, if she misses a Social Security, she won't whine and complain. Yeah, because you're a billionaire. They want to buy the dip. Shock doctrine, right? Naomi Klein.
Yep.
Collapse, profit off the collapse.
Yep.
Then you have the Stephen Millers and the Steve Bannons. And this is where I want to get to the race component to it.
Yep.
They're perfectly fine, it seems, burning the country down to
Yep.
get everyone out and make this a white country again. Talk to us about the Bannon Miller element here.
Well, and to go ahead with Bannon and Miller, it's such a weird thing because you know this as well as I do. It's like when we get into the research component of this to actually understand what's happened. And I always tell people, I have people reach out and they say, oh, in 2016, 2017, you said something that I didn't want to believe was true.
Yeah.
And so like I put it out, and then like in 2019 or 2020, all of a sudden, you know, for me, it's like one of those things where it's like I've been yelling Alexander Dugin's name since
Mm,
2017. And then you turn on CNN on a Sunday, and all of a sudden you're like, we're interviewing Alexander Dugin? Okay, fantastic. Oh, Curtis Yarvin is in the New York Times. This is great. It's escaped containment. The entire reason I'm bringing this up is this: you and I are not psychics. You and I don't necessarily have like a deep throat connection that meets with us in a parking garage. We've simply read what they've said and
yeah,
we've
that's
listened to.
it.
And so when you take a look at someone like Alexander Dugin, who is one of the reasons why the Ukrainian war ever started in the first place, what did he say? He said neoliberalism, and particularly liberal democracy, has reached its final point. It's exhausted, it's been corrupted. We now have the chance to create something new, and by new I mean old, which is to push everyone back into a feudal type stage in which
Yep.
there's like less than 1% of the population that will rule basically everything. And later on, we'll have a war and we'll figure out who rules the larger thing. The plan was this: every single nation state of note would need to become an ethno state. Every single one of them would need to go back to its quote unquote traditional cultures, which they chose because that's the means by which they saw that power would reside in the smallest hands. They would basically push out everybody who wasn't white in Russia, in the United States of America. They would get rid of gay and lesbian and trans people, you name it. They would get rid of all of that. They would bring the population under subjugation, and they would hoard the resources. They would share the power until eventually the survival of the fittest, right? Stephen Miller and Stephen Bannon, they are downstream from Alexander Dugin. And there are large groups of these people who've been having these discussions for a
Yeah.
very long time. And this isn't theoretical. Those meetings are on the record. They admit that they share information. And CPAC has shown it sometimes. We've seen it in the media, you name it.
Peter
They
Thiel.
have, yeah, exactly. These things have all been out in the open. And for people to say this isn't what America is or this isn't possible, I want your viewers and your listeners to hear one thing, which is this: in the story of authoritarianism, fascism, and Nazism, there's one thing that people don't get taught, and it's this. Every single one of these people who has brought this into fruition, they had one advantage and one advantage only, Waj, and that was that the people who were tasked with guarding liberty and freedom and actual plurality, they didn't believe it was possible for things to change.
Mm.
They had a belief in the greatness of America. They had a belief that this system was so well put together that it could never possibly be done. Benito Mussolini in the Doctrines of Fascism said, "We are lucky that liberals and moderates, they do not believe that history can go in two directions, that it can only go forward towards progress, that it's inevitable." And for the record, a lot of people in the United States of America have made that mistake. And it's been
Demographic destiny, the destiny of our
demographic.
demographics.
The Democrats are never going to lose another election, Wash. Right? Like it just couldn't possibly happen. They took advantage of that delusion, and it was a comfortable delusion for these people because it meant that they didn't have to change things. It
Yeah.
meant that they didn't have to work on things. It meant that when Black Lives Matter happens, whenever gay and trans people start talking about like we need to be protected, they could say, hey, you need to chill this one out, right? You need to organize your way out of civil rights being destroyed, right? All of those things. And basically, it kept them from having to change anything. The people that we're talking about have taken advantage of that, and they have a head start. I don't think that means that they're going to win. I still believe that we are going to be victorious, but we have a lot of ground to make up. And we have a lot of courage that we have to display and start believing in.
And Melanie just said Octavia Butler. Octavia Butler called it in the past a brilliant African American writer who used her public library to read and become a writer. And now people are like, "Oh, she was onto something," but she was a black woman and she wasn't given her flowers when she was alive. But
Yes.
thankfully, posthumously, she called all of this, folks. And she said, "All I did was much like you, Jared." She said, "I looked at the surroundings, I looked at the facts, I looked at what was happening, and I imagined 20 years out." That's what Octavia Butler, a science fiction writer, did. And all we did, Sarah Kendzior, you interviewed her for your first live chat, right? She said, I just looked at the information that was out there. I
Yep.
followed the money. I followed the quotes. I've been listening to Steve Bannon when he says that Donald Trump, he looked at Viktor Orban of Hungary, who is an authoritarian leader,
That's
and
right.
said, Orban was Trump before Trump. When
Yep.
Orban was being invited, folks, to the United States by CPAC, when Tucker Carlson goes there and does a softball interview with him, when he got right wing writers saying, Ron Derer saying, you know what, this is a good model for us. Maybe, oh, maybe, Jared, the establishment class should have paid attention instead of doing softball interviews, right? When Peter Thiel grooms JD Vance and hand delivers him as a VP candidate to Donald Trump, even though JD Vance is seen as a beta by MAGA, maybe we should pay attention to him. When Peter Thiel is
They
hanging out with
bought the
white
campaign.
nationalists,
They bought MAGA. They
yeah,
essentially bought MAGA. Yeah.
they literally did. Like literally, Peter Thiel groomed JD Vance and hand delivered him to Trump because their actual vehicle for the broligarchy is not Trump, it's
Yep.
JD Vance. And for Bannon, the vehicle is Trump. And we're seeing friction here, which is good. It's that great meme from Godzilla. Ken Watanabe's
Let them
character says,
fight.
let them fight. And you're
Yep.
seeing this now because now you're seeing Bill Ackman say, whoa, 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 I was perfectly fine supporting Trump when he was going against pro-Palestinian students and the
Yes.
woke, but this has hurt my bottom line. And then Jamie Dimon, who on January, do you see the 180? He said, it's a little inflation's good. Just sit there and take it. Whoa, whoa, whoa. So now
Yes.
you're seeing, and now Elon Musk came out against Pete Navarro, also known as Ron Vera. Yes, Pete. No, can I just tell you that we're run by the dumbest people, folks? If you haven't followed
It's
the story,
incredible.
Donald Trump, as Jared said, is based off his 80s instincts. He's always thought this way about trade deficits because he doesn't understand how trade deficits work. He sees a trade deficit and he thinks since the 80s that the country is screwing us, not realizing how global economies work. So Jared's actually right. He's leaning into that primordial instinct, right? I
Yeah.
think like groceries, trade deficit, he doesn't get it. He relies upon Pete Navarro, who's his economic advisor. Jared Kushner found Pete Navarro in 2017 by Googling on Amazon, saw that he wrote a book that is hawkish on China. That's how Pete Navarro is now the economic whisperer to Donald Trump, who's ailing. And Pete Navarro, for his batshit hawkish theories, cited a man called Ron Vera. Ron Vera, this brilliant man, doesn't exist. Ron Vera is Pete Navarro. How did Pete Navarro come up with the name Ron Vera? It's an anagram of Navarro, Ron Vera. These are the people destroying
That's
the
right.
economy. You would think I'm making this up. I am not. Jared, with our final 5 minutes, thank you so much. I'm so glad people are enjoying our conversation with you and people are discovering you. Jared is writing for dispatches from a collapsing state. He's written fantastic books. He also hosts a podcast. But to give people some hope, you said that you think we're going to win in the long run. Why?
Well, I want to say very, very quickly, because to condense it down, what you just brought up, there is something that's happening here that I don't think a lot of people have really latched onto, which is we now have two different wealth classes. We have a group of people who have wanted to get rid of regulation, basically libertarian Koch brothers style Republicans. We have another group, the broligarchy, whatever we want to call them.
Nerd Reich, whatever.
Their goals are sometimes parallel and sometimes they are completely contradictory. And what we're seeing right now with the economy, it exposes that.
Yep.
It exposes that there aren't just fissures here. It's almost like Neanderthal meeting the modern human. You know, like they have an issue here that is not going to get settled peacefully. But
Nope.
while they're suddenly having this realization, you and I, we've been seeing this for a while. So I actually think for people like us, we're more comfortable in this. We're pissed off, but we're more comfortable in it because what we expected to happen is happening. What's great about this is you can start to see people who didn't want to see it or who didn't have the means to see it or didn't have the access to see it. All of a sudden, people are starting to understand this isn't politics as normal. We're in a new situation. And I think that whenever I look throughout history and I see these crossroads that we're talking about, inevitably there's an equal and opposite reaction where people say, I don't want this. This is destructive. And by the way, what set the ground for this didn't work either. We need something else. And I
Mm,
think a lot of that conservative instinct we've seen with the Democratic Party and with moderates, that isn't even really palatable anymore. There
mm,
has to be something better that isn't about saving what we had or what remains of it, but by going further and realizing we don't deserve this treatment, we don't deserve this destruction, we don't deserve this abuse. We deserve a better life. And what
that's right.
happened before doesn't cut it anymore. And so I do think that we're watching the backlash build. I think it's organic in a way that gives me incredible hope. I think there's going to be a battle. I think it's going to be very intense. I think it's going to be a pitched type
Yeah.
battle, and people need to get ready for it. But I do think that we are going to win in the long run.
No, I think this is I've said this before for anyone who's been watching me. It's a generational fight. To quote
Yes.
Springsteen, this is a long walk. It's not just going to be 2026 and 2028. There's not going to be a light that's going to be flipped on and everything's going to go back, folks. This is a
No.
fight. We're all going to be in it. And every generation has its struggles. We have had to endure much less than our parents and our grandparents. But this is a long term generational fight. And I think where Biden and Democrats and the establishment made mistakes. Look, you and I don't bend the knee to any party, and we call out folks. Biden was, and that class, folks, they did good, but they also wanted restoration. They
Yeah,
didn't want reform. Let me
that's
repeat
right.
this. They wanted restoration. They didn't want reform. And what
Yes.
we kept saying, especially people of color, women, those who were marginalized, you're restoring it back to a time where it really wasn't great for the rest of us. We
Yes.
need bold reform. You're seeing it with the Supreme Court. I'm about to talk to Allison Gill about the Supreme Court right now. Oh no, it's you liberals are a little bit too much. You progressives about reforming the court. It'll be fine. Civility, norms, that's all out the window, folks. We're
Gone.
dealing with a right-wing authoritarian movement. If you don't believe me, open your eyes. Get your hand out of the sand. It is a murder suicide, or as Jared said, a double suicide. They don't care. Donald Trump just over the weekend is said that he's perfectly fine sending U.S. citizens to foreign gulags. And earlier today, Caroline Levitt affirmed it. This is what's happening in America right now.
I just want to say
Go ahead,
very
Jared.
quickly before I go, and you just brought up the disappearing of people to El Salvador. That would have never been possible if we weren't doing that to Muslims during the War on Terror. That doesn't get there. The strategies don't happen. The apparatus doesn't take place. If what we did to other marginalized peoples before this didn't happen and grease the skids to get here. It's the boomerang of empire. It's the boomerang of white supremacy. And what you just brought up is exactly right. The answer to this isn't to go back to 2015.
Nope.
The answer to this is to go forward and create something new and real and human. And with that, I thank you, my friend. Good as always talking. We have so much to catch up on.
This is Jared Yates Sexton. He writes jaredyatessexton.substat.com. It's dispatches from a collapsing state. He has been correct. I've been trying to promote him shamelessly for years, and Sarah and others who have been on the right side of history. Before you quickly leave, Jared, shamelessly promote yourself. Shamelessly.
Yeah, so the book where I laid out that all this was happening, and it's weird to see it happening, is The Midnight Kingdom, A History of Power, Paranoia, and the Coming Crisis. Here we are, and dispatches from a collapsing state.
And if you all enjoyed this, it seemed they did. Jared and I will do another one really soon. Thanks, everyone. Take care. Take care of yourselves. And please, oh, please, don't be a fascist.